Imagine a world where, I don't know, a single photograph of a ballerina with a snake could actually save a whole tour. Or where convincing an entire nation to suddenly love the color green could sell more cigarettes.
Yeah, it sounds like science fiction almost.
Right. Think about someone who didn't just want you to buy something, but was really aiming to subtly influence how you perceived the world, what felt normal even, like what social norms you accepted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of power we're talking about, the power wielded by the man whose methods we're diving into today.
It's quite a journey, isn't it, into the foundations of modern influence and persuasion.
It really is. We are exploring the life and work of Edward Bernays. He's a figure who is widely acknowledged, though sometimes pretty controversially, as the father of public relations.
Or maybe, as Larry Tye, the author of the book we're looking at, puts it, the father of spin.
That too. And our guide for this exploration is largely Larry Tye's work, his book, The Father of Spin, Edward L. Bernays and the Birth of Public Relations. But we're also drawing on other material that sheds light on his, well, fascinating and, frankly, often unsettling campaigns.
Okay, so what's the mission here? What do we want you, the listener, to get out of this deep dive?
Well, our goal, tailored specifically for you, is to really get to grips with Bernays' core concepts. We want to unpack his whole philosophy of engineering consent, understand what he meant by that legendary big think approach.
And we'll use examples, right? Specific ones.
Absolutely. Specific, vivid examples directly from his campaigns. We need to see how these ideas actually played out in the real world, gauge their impact, understand their relevance today.
And maybe explore the big questions they raise about, the forces shaping our own opinions, often without us even realizing it.
Exactly. That's the critical part, the hidden forces.
Okay, let's unpack this. Right from the beginning, Bernays had this almost audacious core belief. It wasn't just about, shilling products. He believed he could change not only how people bought things, but fundamentally the way they thought. How radical was that idea back then compared to just, like, advertising or basic press agentry?
Oh, it was incredibly radical. I mean, think about it. Most people in what was then loosely called publicity or maybe press agentry, they were focused on getting attention, right? Getting your client's name in the paper.
Like P.T. Barnum, maybe.
Exactly like P.T. Barnum, spectacle.
Huh?
Bernays saw something much deeper. He aimed to influence fundamental attitudes, deeply ingrained behaviors, even entire societal norms.
Wow.
He wasn't just trying to get you to prefer, I don't know, one brand of soap over another.
Yeah.
He was trying to make cleanliness itself a kind of public obsession, something everyone aspired to. He genuinely believed he could mold public opinion on a mass scale. He saw the public mind as something, well, something that could be understood and then guided.
Guided or maybe manipulated?
Well, that's the line, isn't it? He called it engineering.
And that belief is where this big think approach comes in, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about a single product promotion.
Exactly. The big think meant moving way beyond just direct transactional promotion. The goal was to fundamentally alter cultural behavior, often on a really large scale, and usually through indirect means.
The indirect means? Like what?
Well, things like strategically planned events or appeals to deeper psychological needs we might not even be aware of, the manipulation of powerful social symbols. It required looking at the whole landscape and asking, okay, how can I change the environment, the context, the very way people see this issue or this behavior so that my client's interest becomes aligned with what people already want or believe?
So the goal wasn't the immediate sale, but changing the culture first.
Precisely.
Mm.
The ultimate objective was large-scale cultural or societal change, because that would ultimately benefit the client in a much more sustained way, far more than a single ad ever could.
So instead of just telling you to buy a car, maybe it was about convincing society that taking road trips was, I don't know, the quintessential American family experience, which would then lead to more car sales down the line.
Exactly. That's the kind of thinking. His specialty wasn't just figuring out that people preferred certain things, but why. He wanted to understand the underlying motivations, the desires, the cultural currents.
The psychology of it all.
Yes. And once he felt he understood that, he looked for ways to subtly re-engineer those preferences. Shift the current so they flowed in a direction that benefited his clients. This demanded not just PR savvy, but a deep, almost intuitive insight into human psychology and the dynamics of societal trends. He was fascinated by group behavior, what he called the group mind, and the herd reaction.
He saw this as something new, didn't he? Something more than just a temporary craft. He really wanted to establish it as a legitimate profession, maybe even a science.
He absolutely did. He strongly contrasted his view with contemporaries like Ivy Lee. Lee also did significant work for big corporations, like the Rockefellers after the Ludlow massacre, a really dark chapter.
Right.
But Lee saw his work as more of an art, something tied to his personal skill that, well, might not outlive his career. Bernays, though, he was determined to outline a distinct methodology, almost like a scientific framework for this process of influencing the public mind.
How did he do that?
He wrote books, he gave lectures, and he deliberately coined the term Council on Public Relations. That sounds more professional, right? More advisory.
Yeah, it does, like a lawyer or a doctor.
Exactly. Suggesting a professional, ethical discipline, he was setting himself apart from mere press agents. He really saw himself as laying the groundwork for a lasting profession based on understanding human behavior.
It's funny, isn't it? Someone who ended up shaping so much of modern commerce and politics almost ended up farming. Larry Tye, the author of the book, mentions his really unexpected start as an agriculture student at Cornell.
Yes, way back in 1908. Apparently his parents were part of that whole back to the soil movement. They were hoping it would ground him, get him away from Manhattan's influences, maybe push him into a practical living from the land.
Clearly didn't stick.
Clearly not his passion. He found something else entirely, something he wasn't even looking for, really, in journalism. He dabbled in it before, but he found his footing writing for a publication called The Medical Review of Reviews.
Okay.
And that led directly to one of his very first and most telling campaigns. This was back in 1913. He was working for the Journal, and they published a positive review of a play called Damaged Goods.
Damaged Goods. What was it about?
It tackled syphilis head-on. A deeply taboo subject back then, obviously. And because of that, it was facing censorship in New York City.
Wow, that sounds like an impossible situation for a publicist. How do you promote a play about a taboo disease that the authorities literally want to shut down?
But that's where you see Bernays' early big think instinct already kicking in. He didn't just see censorship as a roadblock. As Larry Tye points out, Bernays believed you could accomplish pretty much anything if you could just redefine the obstacles, turn them into opportunities.
Okay, how?
It required insight into how people perceived the situation, and then creatively prodding them, nudging them to see it differently. With Damaged Goods, the key was to transform the controversy from something shameful into a worthy cause.
A cause? How?
By recruiting unimpeachable public figures to back it. People whose reputations were beyond question.
And he did that by forming a seemingly independent group, like a front group.
Exactly. He formed one called the Medical Review of Reviews Sociological Fund Committee. Sounds very official, very academic, doesn't it? High-minded.
It does.
He used an appeal that highlighted the playwright Richard Bennett's reputation as a serious artist and framed the play itself as part of this noble fight against sex pruriency and general prudishness.
Clever framing.
But,
and he managed to get some incredibly powerful names on board.
Truly distinguished list for the time. John D. Rockefeller Jr., Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt Sr., Franklin D. Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor, Reverend John Haynes Holmes.
Right.
Really prominent figures.
Wow, how did he get them involved?
Each member was asked for just a modest $4 donation for a ticket. But the real goal wasn't the money, it was getting their endorsements. This was strategically designed to preempt police intervention. I mean, if Rockefeller Jr. and the Roosevelts were backing it, how could the police possibly shut it down as immoral?
Genius. And did it work?
It absolutely did. Hundreds of checks poured in, not just for tickets, but as contributions to the fund. And luminaries like Rockefeller Jr. provided these glowing testimonials, praising the play for making frank discussion possible. Larry Tye notes this was the first time Bernays, or perhaps anyone, had assembled such a prestigious front group for this kind of purpose.
So the core insight here is basically you can legitimize a controversial topic or client by getting respected names to associate with it. You're essentially borrowing their credibility.
Precisely. It's a technique that remains incredibly powerful today. The author points to modern examples. You see anti-nuclear groups, pro-nuclear groups, trucking industry coalitions, all using similar tactics. They often hide their corporate or political backing behind these seemingly independent committees or organizations fronted by prominent names.
So this early maneuver became a fundamental, enduring tool in public relations.
Absolutely. It shows how early on he understood the power of third-party validation.
He refined this idea too, didn't he? This idea of hitching private interests to public ones in other early campaigns, like for the play Daddy Longlegs.
Right. The goal there was a bit different. It was about adding a layer of social good to the simple act of attending the theater. Bernays partnered with the New York State Charities Aid Association to create these Daddy Longlegs funds in colleges and high schools.
And what did those funds do?
The money raised allowed private families to afford taking in orphans. So, by buying a ticket, you weren't just seeing a play. You felt like you were contributing to helping orphan children. It made entertainment feel philanthropic.
Very clever. Then came a really different challenge with the Ballet Russe tour in 1915. Selling European high culture, Russian dance, and, well, men in tights to what was then a less sophisticated American audience. That must have been tough.
He admitted he was just as ignorant about ballet as the public he needed to reach. His first step was basically self-education, which evolved into what we might now call early opinion research.
How did he do that?
He dug through libraries, he talked to dance experts, and he just chatted with people on the street, trying to form educated guesses about their perceptions of ballet and what the barriers to acceptance might be.
And this research led to some creative, maybe even outlandish tactics, like the famous snake stunt.
Yes, that's a classic.
Yeah.
He needed to get attention for the principal ballerina, Flores Reval, and a standard press conference just wasn't cutting through the noise. His solution: photograph her at the Bronx Zoo with a harmless snake draped around her shoulder.
The snake. Seriously.
Seriously. The caption then spun this whole story about her charm rendering the cobra harmless, and how she supposedly visited the zoo daily for inspiration.
Okay, that sounds like pure press agent showmanship. Like, where's the PR big think insight there?
Well, the insight is that visual spectacle and engineered controversy, even something as simple as a snake, could bypass traditional gatekeepers, the editors, the critics, and command attention in a very crowded media landscape. Brain himself noted that without that stunt or something equivalent, Reval's might have taken years to gain national recognition. The snake took up a long lag time, as he put it.
So it was about grabbing eyeballs quickly.
Exactly. It's that early understanding that the medium and the spectacle can be the message, grabbing attention when conventional methods fail.
But he went beyond just stunts for the Ballet Russe, didn't he?
Crucially, yes. This is where you see the big think really broaden. He realized press coverage alone was limiting. So he went to manufacturers, people making jewelry, handbags, lampshades, table linens, and he enticed them to create products inspired by the Ballet Russe's sets and costumes.
That's brilliant.
It really was. It integrated the artistic event right into consumer culture, making it tangible and desirable in everyday life. It connected high art to fashion and home goods, things people understood and wanted.
He later made a pretty bold claim about the tour's impact, didn't he? Like revolutionary impact.
He did. He claimed it revolutionized American taste, made modern art more palatable, and was a turning point in the appreciation of arts in the U.S. Now, that's probably exaggerated, but it definitely shows his ambition. He wanted to see his work as having a profound cultural impact, not just selling tickets.
He applied similar methods with Enrico Caruso, too, the famous opera singer. Close observation, crisis management.
Starting around 1917, yes. His basic tactics were familiar press releases, visiting editors, coining phrases like the man with the orchid-lined voice. But he also immersed himself in Caruso's life, traveled with him, was basically on call 24/7.
Why so close?
Well, it allowed him to be present for and often spin unexpected events, little crises or quirks.
Like the time Caruso apparently slid under a table at a banquet.
Or demanded 17 pillows.
Exactly those. Caruso, terrified of a draft, literally slid under the table and wouldn't come out until Bernays got the window closed. And the infamous pillow incident in Pittsburgh, Caruso demanded 17 extra pillows for his hotel bed. And guess who was arranging the bedding? Bernays, the PR man.
That's dedication. And that led to his own poem, didn't it? The Pillowcases.
Yes, where he recounts how Caruso's luggage actually contained musical scores, not pillows. But Bernays spun the story that the great singer transported his own special bedding everywhere he went just to get press coverage. Larry Tye highlights this poem. While Bernays tried to make it sound like poetic ingenuity, it really underscores that fine line he often walked between cleverness and, well, outright chicanery.
Making things up for press?
He admitted it, using a fabricated story to get press where none would have existed otherwise. It shows his pragmatism, maybe, but also raises ethical questions early on. Okay, let's move to some campaigns where the engineering of consent really tackled massive social behaviors. His work for American tobacco under George Hill is legendary, particularly around breaking the taboo against women smoking in public.
Oh, this was a huge cultural obstacle back then. I mean, it was simply not done for respectable women to smoke openly in public. And the tobacco industry saw the sweets industry as a direct competitor. Someone reaching for a cigarette wasn't reaching for dessert, right?
Makes sense. So his big think approach here wasn't just about advertising Lucky Stripes. It was about changing the entire social acceptability of women smoking. And he even launched an anti-sweets campaign first.
He did, and he used his favorite tactic, enlisting experts. He convinced a photographer friend, Nicholas Murray, to solicit other artists and photographers to publicly praise the ideal of the thin woman. Murray's letter, quoted by Larry Tye, explicitly suggested that a slender woman, quote, instead of overeating sweets and desserts, lights a cigarette.
Wow, that's direct. He expanded this, didn't he? Getting endorsements from all sorts of groups.
Yes. He prepared similar surveys, and you have to imagine quotes around surveys for actors, athletes, beautiful girls, society women, even male dancers. He even got the dancing mogul Arthur Murray to sign a letter claiming that dancers, needing to avoid overindulgence, would reach for a cigarette instead of dessert.
Using perceived authorities to normalize the behavior.
Exactly. And he also tried to directly change behavior, not just perception.
Well, so?
He urged hotels to add cigarettes to their dessert menus. And he distributed menus prepared by a house and garden editor that suggested, after a sensible meal, naturally, to reach for a cigarette instead of dessert.
So the insight here is multifaceted. Associate your product with desirability, thinness, glamour. Use the perceived authority of experts. And try to integrate the product into existing rituals, like after-meal choices.
Precisely. And he saw controversy as beneficial, didn't he? He liked stirring things up and fighting from a position of, quote, high ground.
Yeah, Bernays knew controversy-generated press, and he deliberately created it. By framing the issue as this new competition between sweets and cigarettes, he got responses from figures like bank presidents and economists generating news, and he always sought that high ground, presenting his clients' interests in terms of health or freedom or progress, no matter how tenuous the link might seem. George Hill, his client at American Tobacco, was reportedly delighted, feeling they had shut them up pretty well.
Hill also loved the idea of using glamour, specifically the Ziegfeld girls.
Ah, yes, a classic use of celebrity. Bernays formed the Ziegfeld Contour, Curve, and Charm Club with 6 dancers who publicly pledged to renounce sweets and smoke cigarettes. It directly linked smoking to the glamorous, desired body shape of the time.
But the ultimate big think stunt to break that public taboo was the Torches of Freedom March.
Easter Sunday, 1929. Tell us about that. It sounds dramatic.
Oh, it was pure theater, built entirely on powerful symbolism. He got a list of debutante society women and had his secretary, Bertha Hunt, send them a telegram using really compelling, evocative language. Larry Tye quotes the text. It said things like, in the interests of equality of the sexes and to fight another sex taboo, I and other young women will light another torch of freedom by smoking cigarettes while strolling on Fifth Avenue Easter Sunday. Combat the silly prejudice that the cigarette is suitable for the home, but never, no, never for the sidewalk.
Torches of Freedom. Wow, they planned a specific stroll down Fifth Avenue at a specific time.
Yes, meticulously planned, and it worked exactly as planned. It generated widespread, often front-page coverage across the country. A United Press dispatch quoted Bertha Hunt calling the cigarettes torches of freedom that would smash the discriminatory taboo. Larry Tye highlights this as an irresistible script for a stunt, flawlessly executed, covered in nearly every paper in America with no one detecting the fingerprints of Bernays or American Tobacco behind it.
So the insight here is, link a controversial behavior, women smoking in public, to a powerful, positive social symbol. In this case, liberation, equality, tapping into the momentum of the women's suffrage movement. Make it seem acceptable, even aspirational.
Exactly. And think about how brands and campaigns today still try to align themselves with social causes or use symbols of empowerment or progress. It's a direct descendant of this hitching private interest to public ones principle, using cultural currents to sell a product or an idea.
What's really interesting, though, and maybe a little concerning, is how Bernays later talked about this event.
Yes, Larry Tye notes a fascinating discrepancy. In his 1965 memoirs, Bernays spoke of the slow, gradual process involved in breaking down social conventions, like the smoking taboo. But by the early 1970s, he was telling an oral historian that overnight the taboo was broken by one overt act, meaning the 1929 march.
So he exaggerated the immediate impact later on.
It seems so.
Yeah.
Which conflicts with his own earlier, probably more accurate understanding of how societal change actually happens.
Yeah.
It suggests he was maybe polishing his own legend a bit.
And his creativity for American tobacco seemed limitless. Didn't he propose a tobacco society for voice culture?
He did. The idea was that smoking somehow improved throat chords, leading to better singing. He even proposed getting a smoking teacher for every singer. It was maybe intended to be fun, a bit absurd, but the underlying strategy was still there. Link smoking to voice health, even claiming it helped one swallow anything, another veiled jab at sweets.
George Hill, the head of American Tobacco, sounds like quite a character himself.
Bernays described Hill as acting like a general in command. Interestingly, while Bernays later claimed he deplored the methods used, he rationalized working for him by saying if a respected company behaved like that, it must be accepted corporate behavior. He even compared it to fighting a war.
But later he was less charitable.
Yes, years later, perhaps with more distance, Bernays called Hill a troglodyte, a dictator. Shows how perspectives can change, or maybe how he wanted to distance himself later.
Okay, another classic Big Think campaign for Lucky Strike involved the color of the package itself. The green package.
Ah, yes. This is one of the most audacious examples of his thinking. The problem was simple. Lucky Strike's package was green. And green clashed with the dominant fashion colors of the time, particularly in women's clothing and accessories. George Hill wanted to change the package color, but he was terrified of losing invaluable brand recognition built up over years.
So Bernays' solution wasn't about the package at all. It was incredibly bold. If you won't change the color of the package, change the color of fashion to green.
It sounds completely eccentric, doesn't it? Maybe even arrogant to think you could just change an entire nation's taste in colors on a whim. But Bernays was confident he could influence trends.
How did he even start?
He started by researching the color green itself. He consulted a book called The Language of Color. It told him green was an emblem of hope, victory, and plenty, and symbolical of solitude and peace. So, positive associations he could build upon. He also shrewdly noted that green was already appearing in about 20% of French fashion lines, giving him a foothold, a trend to amplify.
He needed a big splash, a major event to launch this color shift.
And he planned one. A green ball, or bal vert, held at the prestigious Waldorf Astoria Hotel. It involved debutantes, the daughters of high society, and crucially, it was tied to a charity, giving it that veneer of social acceptability and importance.
And he got a big name to host it?
Yes, he secured Mrs. Frank A. Vanderlip, a very prominent social figure, as the hostess. That lent further prestige and credibility to the whole affair.
Then he targeted the fashion industry itself, right?
Directly. He approached Philip Vogelmann, who was president of the Onondaga Silk Company, a major fabric manufacturer. He basically told Vogelmann, look, here's your chance to be the leader in this new trend towards green if you act quickly. Vogelmann agreed. They then hosted fashion editors at the Waldorf for a special Green Fashions Fall Luncheon.
And the menu was all green.
Absolutely. Green beans, asparagus tip salad with green dressing, lamb chops with green mint sauce, green mince for dessert, creme de menthe liqueur. It was a full sensory experience designed to immerse the influential editors in the color green.
And did they have speakers to add intellectual weight?
Oh, yes. They had the head of Hunter College's art department talk about green in the work of great artists, and a psychologist discussed the psychological implications of the color green, making it seem like a serious artistic and cultural trend. The press coverage followed naturally with headlines like, "It looks like a green winter."
But what about potential objections? Like, wouldn't women worry about green clothes clashing with their home decor or their own complexions?
Bernays anticipated this. They created something called the Color Fashion Bureau, operating under the umbrella of Onondaga Silk, to offer advice. They sent letters to interior decorators, department store buyers, women's clubs, put out announcements to stores on how to incorporate green.
And the skin tone issue.
They even addressed that directly, putting out advice suggesting green was universally flattering, quote, most becoming to all degrees of burns, from the first strawberry flush to the last Indian brown.
That's quite a claim. Did this create a bandwagon effect? Did green actually become fashionable?
It seems it did. Mrs. Vanderlip's invitation committee for the Green Ball included other social luminaries, like Mrs. James Roosevelt. Stores started filling their windows with green merchandise. Vogue magazine ran sketches of green dresses. Bernays was apparently particularly pleased when even a competitor, Camel Cigarettes, started using green in their advertising. That, to him, confirmed the trend he had instigated had truly taken hold.
The underlying insight here is just profound, isn't it? If you can't change the product to fit the world, change the world around the product to make it fit and be desirable. Influence trends at a fundamental cultural level, and the market for your product will naturally follow.
Exactly. It's about shaping the environment.
It sounds wild, but isn't this exactly what trend forecasters, color institutes like Pantone, or even today's influencer marketing tries to do? Shape preferences for colors, styles, ideas on a massive scale.
It's absolutely the same principle. Identifying or maybe even creating a cultural wave and then riding it or actively steering it to benefit your client or product.
Sure.
Bernays was doing this conceptually decades before most people even conceived of it.
Larry Tai also notes that Bernays believed applying psychoanalysis to advertising was new at the time, citing a psychoanalyst named A. Brill's analysis of a cigarette poster.
Yes, this highlights his ongoing interest in the deeper psychological drivers of consumer behavior, pulling in ideas from his famous uncle, Sigmund Freud.
He also suggested, in a 1931 memo, aggressively targeting black customers, even detailing demographics and suggesting contact with the black press.
He did, but American Tobacco declined the suggestion. Reportedly, they feared it would alienate their white clients in the South. It's a stark reminder of the pervasive social prejudices of the time and how they could override even a profit-driven suggestion from someone like Bernays.
This brings us to a really critical and frankly disturbing point. Bernays' knowledge, or suspected knowledge, of the dangers of smoking. He later claimed in 1972 that no one knew cigarettes caused cancer when he worked for Hill. He even used old opera star endorsements claiming cigarettes were kind to your throat, as if that proved his point.
But that claim is directly contradicted by the evidence found in his own papers, which became public after his death. Larry Tai states clearly that Bernays had reason to suspect the dangers of smoking as early as 1930. His paper strongly suggests he actively helped his client, American Tobacco, keep these doubts hidden from the public.
Wait, so he knew, or had very strong reasons to suspect, smoking was dangerous while he was running these campaigns, linking it to health, glamour, thinness, even voice culture. That feels fundamentally different. What does that tell us about his approach?
That's a critical point, and it raises significant ethical questions about the real-world consequences of his engineering of consent. It suggests a willingness, perhaps even an eagerness, to promote a product he had reason to believe was harmful, prioritizing his client's interests above public health. This wasn't just about selling hairnets or making cream popular. This was a product with severe, potentially fatal consequences. Larry Tai highlights that this discrepancy between Bernays' later public claims and the evidence in his private papers is a major point of contention when evaluating his legacy. It moves beyond simply influencing taste to potentially concealing harm, which is a much darker interpretation of his work.
Moving beyond tobacco, he applied those same wartime propaganda techniques he'd learned working for the U.S. government's Committee on Public Information during World War I, applying them to peacetime commerce. He really believed consumers could be made to adjust their tastes, rather than products just passively responding to existing demand.
A good example is his work for Venita hairnets back in the 1920s. The problem was women were cutting their hair short. Bobbed hair was the style, partly due to factory work during the war, partly copying fashion figures like the dancer Irene Castle. This meant much less demand for hairnets.
So he didn't try to convince women that short hair was bad, did he? He created new reasons to need hairnets.
Exactly. His counterattack was indirect. First, he got health officials to urge or even order food workers to wear nets for hygiene reasons. Then he got labor leaders to urge factory workers to wear nets for safety, to prevent hair from getting caught in machinery.
Ah, practical reasons.
Right. And finally, he got leading artists and fashion authorities to proclaim that long, flowing locks, which of course required nets, were the true standard for American beauty. The insight: if you can't change the prevailing fashion directly, change the rules around it, or change the perceived standard of beauty or safety to create a new need for your product.
Luggage makers faced a similar problem in the late 1920s, didn't they? Flapper fashions took up less space, and ships and trains were allocating less room for baggage. Salesmen were traveling lighter.
Again, Bernays didn't just run ads saying buy bigger suitcases. He launched this multi-pronged, indirect counterattack. He got magazines and newspapers to promote the idea that well-bred travelers naturally carried large wardrobes. He urged architects to design more closet space in new homes.
Really influencing architects.
Apparently so. He advised colleges to tell students they needed many bags for school. He even got health officials involved again, arguing that sharing a valise was somehow unsanitary. And of course, he used celebrity endorsement, getting the popular singer-comedian Eddie Cantor to pose for photos while packing a big trunk.
So the insight again is create a social or practical imperative for using more of the product by influencing societal expectations and even physical requirements like closet space.
Exactly, reshape the landscape.
These examples really show his remarkable ability to look way beyond the immediate product and try to reshape the entire cultural or practical landscape to create a need or desire. This really is the essence of that big think.
And this leads us to one of his most significant and arguably longest-lasting big think achievements. His work for Mack trucks and the push for the interstate highway system starting in 1949. Mack Trucks was facing severe competition from the railroads, which were running campaigns portraying trucks as road destroyers and lobbying hard for high taxes on the trucking industry.
Okay, so the problem was that trucks had this negative image because they seemed to damage roads. Bernays' solution wasn't just to say, buy Mack trucks. Was it?
No, his audacious solution was this. Since a present fix for the road problem wasn't really possible, promise a future solution. He believed that if he could work to bring about future road satisfaction, basically, better roads, then the public's gripe against heavy trucks would naturally dissipate. His idea, incredibly, was to promote truck sales by building roads. Larry Ty notes Bernays called this the most indirect kind of indirection.
That sounds incredibly ambitious. I mean, that required not just changing public opinion, but influencing massive national infrastructure policy.
It was unbelievably ambitious. It required persuading Mack trucks themselves to think very long-term and delay immediate gratification. And even tougher, convincing the U.S. Congress to commit billions of dollars for a national highway system. But he set out to do it.
And Larry Ty notes this campaign actually set a model for modern lobbying.
Absolutely. Bernays united disparate elements of the trucking industry against their common enemy, the railroads. He rallied the public by appealing directly to their concerns, framing it around easing traffic congestion and promising easier, faster travel in the future. And he ultimately proved that Congress could be persuaded to spend billions on a massive national project like the Interstate system, based partly on this kind of campaign of engineered public support.
So the insight is, address the systemic problem that hurts your client, even if it's huge, and requires long-term multi-stakeholder influence, because solving the root cause is the ultimate PR success.
That's the big think in action on a national scale.
Bernays also applied his methods, which clearly became quite sophisticated over time, to politics as well.
Yes, his political strategies evolved significantly. What might have started as more ad hoc publicity for politicians like Calvin Coolidge or Herbert Hoover became much more analytical and data-driven by the 1940s.
That sophistication really comes through in his work for William O'Dwyer's mayoral campaign in New York City in 1940. Bernays had a requirement then that sounds commonplace today, but was apparently groundbreaking at the time.
He told O'Dwyer, flat out, I can only give advice if I first know what people's attitudes are. Now, at a time when political campaigning was largely based on intuition, rallies, backroom deals, the notion of scientifically measuring public sentiment, as Larry Ty points out, seemed almost quixotic. But Bernays insisted.
And he conducted pretty extensive research to figure that out.
Oh, yeah. He scattered his staff across all 5 boroughs of New York, interviewing 1,000 voters. He analyzed past election results, demographic data. He undertook what he called a psychological survey of different groups, religious, ethnic, professional specifically, to discover the emotional or logical basis for attitude and action relevant to the campaign.
That sounds exactly like the precursor to modern political polling and voter segmentation, micro-targeting.
It absolutely is. The output was this 46-page document of recommendations, which Larry Ty describes as perhaps the first truly sophisticated voter portrait of its kind. It broke down the necessary appeals by voter group with incredible detail.
Can you give an example of how detailed it was? What kind of advice did he give?
Okay, so for Irish Catholics, the advice was to highlight O'Dwyer's effective work as a district attorney prosecuting the notorious crime syndicate Murder, Inc., alongside stressing his strong Democratic Party credentials. For Italian voters, the strategy suggested emphasizing police reform, O'Dwyer's political independence, and subtly mentioning that the incumbent mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, had perceivedly failed to appoint Italians to prominent city jobs.
Wow.
For union members, focus on his pro-labor stance. For big business, emphasize his fairness in labor disputes. It was micro-targeting before that term even existed, based on deep demographic and psychological analysis.
In the 1932 Hoover campaign, though, facing the depths of the Great Depression, his strategy sounds quite different, focusing more on dividing the opposition.
Yes. The goal there, facing an uphill battle against Franklin Roosevelt, was to try and peel off voters who had supported Al Smith, the previous Democratic candidate. essentially appealing specifically to conservative Democrats. Tactics included spotlighting prominent Democrats who opposed Roosevelt and trying desperately to portray Hoover as courageous and humane despite the ongoing economic crisis.
There was also an interesting, maybe cynical piece of advice in that campaign strategy paper.
Yes, the strategy paper explicitly advised appealing to instinct over reason. It recommended keeping in mind the human tendency to symbolize leaders seeking someone who seemed Achilles heel-proof,
Yeah.
invincible. It talked about responding to people's inferiority complex by making them feel superior to a fool and creating issues that appealed deliberately to pugnacious instincts.
Appeal to instinct, not reason. That's a pretty direct statement about manipulating voter behavior, isn't it?
It shows a clear understanding, or belief, in the power of non-rational factors in decision-making, particularly during a time of national crisis like the Depression. Despite these strategies, however, the grim economic reality was just too overwhelming, and Hoover suffered a massive defeat. The engineering of consent clearly had its limits when faced with widespread tangible suffering.
Bernays was apparently fascinated by politicians who did succeed, especially James Farley, FDR's legendary campaign manager.
Yes, he found Farley alluring, not just for his incredible success in electing FDR multiple times, but because Farley was apparently quite willing to share his methods. Farley himself attributed FDR's success partly to factors like having a great name, a great radio voice, a winning smile, traits. Bernays certainly understood the value of presenting effectively to the public.
And Farley had a technique that sounds incredibly simple now, but was revolutionary back then.
Yes, using a check-writing machine, basically an early automated autographer, to send out what appeared to be personal letters to thousands of Democratic county chairmen across the country. Mass mailings simply weren't done on that scale then. Farley claimed that by the time he finished sending those letters, FDR's nomination was essentially in the bag.
Bernays was incredibly impressed by Farley, wasn't he?
He was. He noted Farley's imposing physical height, his genuine warmth, describing his handshake as the kind of handshake you read about in your civics books, the handshake that elects presidents. But what truly seemed to captivate Bernays, the man of systems and science, was Farley's instinctiveness, his practical wisdom with no theories. Bernays seemed almost envious of Farley's innate ability to connect with and influence people without relying on complex frameworks.
Bernays' reach also extended internationally, though some of his favorite stories about this have been called into question over time.
Yes, his tale about advising Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, the Czech nationalist leader, back in 1918 is one he often recounted. He claimed Masaryk planned to declare Czechoslovak independence on a Saturday. Bernays supposedly advised him to wait until Sunday.
Why Sunday?
So the news would dominate the typically slow Monday morning newspapers via the wire services. Maximum impact.
And Masaryk reportedly protested, saying something like, that would be making history for the wire service cables.
And Bernays' famous, perhaps self-serving reply was, I assured him that cables make history. According to Bernays' version, Masaryk waited. It's a great story, right?
Yeah.
It perfectly reinforces Bernays' view of the immense power of media timing and manipulation.
But is the story actually true?
Well, Larry Tye points to significant doubts raised by historian George Kovtun. There are inconsistencies, like Bernays apparently mixing up dates later in life. The official Czech holiday for independence is October 28th, which wasn't tied to a Sunday in that period. And perhaps most significantly, Masaryk's own detailed memoirs about his time in America make absolutely no mention of Bernays at all. So, Larry Tye concludes the story is rather doubtful.
Another questionable international anecdote involved Golda Meir much later in the 1950s.
Right. Bernays claimed he met with her when she was Israel's foreign minister and was apparently struggling in her dealings with U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. Bernays said Meir was so impressed with his advice that she actually offered him her job on the spot. Why not take it now? And I will go back to my old cabinet post, which was labor. Bernays claimed he politely declined.
And again...
Again, Meir's own memoirs make no mention whatsoever of Bernays or this alleged, rather extraordinary offer. So these stories, while certainly entertaining and self-aggrandizing for Bernays, suggest he might have significantly embellished his international impact, especially in later years when recounting his career.
His work for the government of India in the early 1950s seems more concrete, though it didn't end well either. Tensions were high then between the U.S. and India, largely due to India's policy of non-alignment during the Cold War and the U.S. favoring Pakistan in the dispute over Kashmir. American perceptions of India at the time were often, well, simplistic or stereotypical.
Right. Things like man-eating tigers, child brides, holy cows, untouchables, snake charmers. Very basic, often negative images. Bernays offered his services to improve India's image in the U.S. for a significant retainer plus expenses. Early on, he felt he was making progress, cementing relations with the ambassador at the time, Madame Pandit, and noting an improvement in the general climate of opinion towards India in the U.S. press.
But it fell apart with the next ambassador.
Yes, relations with Pandit's successor, Ambassador Sen, apparently collapsed after an incident where the Indian consul general in New York allegedly threatened war if the New York Times didn't change its editorial stance on Kashmir. Bernays, despite his own history of aggressive tactics, wrote an angry letter to his Indian employers and resigned. He cited their regrettable tendency to underestimate American intelligence and integrity.
Interesting. So even Bernays had a line, or maybe it was just about his own reputation being potentially damaged by his client's perceived heavy-handedness.
It's hard to say for sure, but it shows a break at least.
Okay. Perhaps the most controversial international involvement in a major Big Think campaign with truly devastating real-world consequences was his work for the United Fruit Company in Guatemala.
Yes, this is a deeply complex and troubling case. Larry Tye provides crucial background here. The United Fruit Company, or UFCO, grew from a small banana trading operation into this massive, powerful corporation by 1899. They controlled vast amounts of land, railroads, and wielded immense political influence in Central America, which is why countries where they operated were sometimes dismissively called banana republics. Figures like Samuel Zemurray, known as Sam the Banana Man, were notorious for their cunning, even plotting government overthrows to protect company interests. By 1949, UFCO was huge, profitable, and basically an empire within multiple countries.
And Guatemala itself had undergone significant political change around that time.
Yes, a mass uprising in 1944 ended a long military dictatorship leading to democratic elections. Two successive presidents, Juan José Arevalo and then Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, implemented significant reforms, strengthening democratic institutions, building schools and hospitals, establishing Social Security, improving workers' rights. These reforms were naturally seen as threatening by powerful traditional elites and very much by UFCO.
The flashpoint was land reform, wasn't it?
Exactly. The 1952 Agrarian Reform Law aimed to redistribute large, unused land holdings to landless peasants. It specifically targeted properties like UFCO's vast uncultivated estates.
And UFCO reacted strongly, claiming unfair treatment and ridiculously low valuation for their expropriated land.
They did, and they immediately appealed directly to the U.S. State Department for help. It's important to note that UFCO's prior PR firm, Hill & Knowlton, had already started a campaign portraying the Arbenz government as communist, which generated negative publicity for Guatemala in the U.S. President Arbenz saw this campaign as a direct threat, a prelude to intervention.
So Bernays' work for UFCO built on this existing anti-communist narrative using his unique methods.
Yes. He leveraged his connections, notably with the publisher of the New York Times, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, who was actually related by marriage to Bernays' wife, Doris Fleischman. Bernays actively tried to influence the Times coverage, prodding them to publish stories favorable to UFCO, complaining about journalists he felt were too critical, and even contacting Sulzberger directly to complain about a letter to the editor written by the artist Rockwell Kent, labeling Kent a fellow traveler, and his letter covert propaganda.
His tactics sound incredibly aggressive, even for him.
They were. Even after the Guatemalan government offered UFCO a new labor contract, Bernays dismissed it in his communications as merely a tactical retreat by the communists. He insisted on continuing strong aggressive tactics, pointing the finger at communism. His stated focus was explicitly on making visible to the American people the communist penetration of Guatemala really is.
And his definition of communist was pretty broad.
Incredibly broad. Larry Tye notes that Bernays' internal memos for UFCO listed not just actual communists, but also social reformers, ultranationalists as collaborators. Essentially, anyone pushing for reforms that impacted UFCO's bottom line was painted with the same red brush.
And he used the press and propaganda as his main weapons in this fight.
Absolutely. He provided lists of influential people, including officials in the CIA, the State Department, the Defense Department, and members of Congress who might want reprints of favorable articles, offering them at no expense, which is clearly a way of distributing UFCO's propaganda under the guise of objective information. He suggested arranging for a friendly member of Congress to reprint a pro-UFCO article in the Congressional Record for even wider dissemination to opinion molders. There were plans to mail 300,000 brochures titled Communism in Guatemala 22 Facts to American Legion posts across the entire country.
It was a full-scale propaganda effort. aimed at convincing the American public and policymakers that the democratically elected Arbenz government was a dangerous Soviet beachhead.
Precisely. And this intense PR campaign coincided with increasing pressure from the Eisenhower administration in the U.S.
Yeah, the timing seems critical.
It was. The State Department, heavily influenced by UFCO's lobbying and the prevailing anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy era, adopted an increasingly hardline stance against Arbenz. This culminated dramatically on June 18, 1954, with a CIA-orchestrated invasion by a small force, maybe 200 men, led by an exiled Guatemalan colonel named Carlos Castillo Armas. This force was supported by CIA-piloted air attacks. Interestingly, Bernays, in his own materials, referred to this invading group as an army of liberation.
The outcome was swift, wasn't it? And had incredibly long-lasting negative consequences for Guatemala.
Devastatingly so. The invasion led to Arbenz's resignation within days. A military junta took control on June 27th, and Castillo Armas was installed as president about a week later. The land reform program was immediately rolled back, UFCO got its land back, and Guatemala descended into decades of political instability, repression, and civil war.
And UFCO had powerful allies directly involved in the Eisenhower administration at the time.
Larry Tye highlights this crucial context. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother, CIA Director Alan Dulles, both had past legal connections to UFCO's main law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. The Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, John M. Cabot, was actually from a family with significant UFCO stock holdings. And powerful figures in Congress like John McCormick and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge were also strong allies of the company. It shows a really powerful alignment of corporate, political, and intelligence interests working together.
Bernays even continued to advise the new Armas regime after the coup, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He suggested Armas hold a press conference to blame the country's economic problems entirely on the previous Arbenz regime and proposed bringing in a U.S. expert to fix things. He even received inside tips from the UFCO man on the ground in Guatemala about specific questions Armas wanted to be asked during an upcoming visit to the U.S., allowing for a carefully prescripted and controlled public narrative.
Years later, this whole Guatemala campaign came back to haunt Bernays, particularly through a book called On the Inside, written by Thomas McCann, who had actually worked for UFCO during that period.
Right. McCann's book described the PR campaign, including Bernays' role, as essentially fabricating stories of a communist menace purely for UFCO's self-interest, to justify U.S. intervention and protect the company's assets. This was a direct and public challenge to Bernays' carefully crafted narrative about the events.
And Bernays, even though he was 84 by then, reacted furiously.
Oh, absolutely, furiously. He wrote directly to McCann's publisher, warning of inaccuracies and potential embarrassment, insisting vehemently that the communist threat in Guatemala had been real and not concocted. He even threatened lawsuits. But McCann, backed by his attorney, stood firm, basically telling Bernays to stop or face legal action himself. That reportedly silenced Bernays publicly on the matter, though privately he remained incredibly angry and disparaging towards McCann for years.
Larry Tye suggests this conflict touched on Bernays' deep, almost obsessive concern for his legacy.
Absolutely. Bernays saw himself as a principled liberal anti-communist, not some paranoid McCarthyite pawn. McCann's book, in Bernays' view, suggested he had been a patsy, manipulated by UFCO and the government, rather than the master strategist pulling the strings. This reevaluation threatened his carefully constructed image of being in control and acting on high-minded principles, even if those principles were about manipulating public opinion for his clients.
And even late in life, he was still focused on communism.
Yes, some of his later book proposals offered his expertise to help stop a perceived crusade against communism by using sound-proven procedures of communication, public education, and public persuasion, or his signature phrase, engineering of consent. He seemed to feel that many anti-communist groups were just expressing themselves emotionally, carrying out a catharsis, he called it, rather than using effective scientific methodology like his. It suggests he still saw these methods as tools potentially for social good, despite the evidence of how they had been used in Guatemala.
Let's turn to Bernays' personal life for a bit. It also seems to show how he applied his big think worldview, even at home. His marriage to Doris Fleischman is particularly interesting.
Doris was definitely a force in her own right. She initially kept her maiden name after marriage, which was highly unusual for the time, though she did eventually change it. She was an absolutely indispensable part of the Bernays office, a highly skilled wordsmith, the editor of their influential newsletter Contact, and often ghostwrote articles and even parts of books for him. Larry Ty notes her writing often had a richer vocabulary and a more poetic flourish than Eddie's own rather direct style. She was, in the author's description, the princess of publicity to his prince.
And her own writings hinted at some of the complexities of their relationship and her role as a woman.
Yes, her 1955 book explored marriage and womanhood, describing the modern bride having to assume a kind of domestic omnipotence and effectively split her personality between her professional and private lives. This suggests a keen awareness of the challenges faced by ambitious professional women trying to balance societal expectations.
And there are hints of tension within their marriage, not always smooth sailing.
Their daughter, Anne Bernays, has spoken about her sense that her father, Eddie, wanted Doris to be a public feminist figure outside the home, but expected a more traditional Victorian wife inside. Doris was reportedly quite uncomfortable with Eddie's constant flirting with other women, even warning Anne about his secretaries. Larry Ty mentions a period where Doris apparently played solitaire constantly, suggesting some inner turmoil or unhappiness, and there was apparently a suspected affair by Eddie at one point. And Bernays is reportedly using their complex relationship as inspiration for a novel, which tells you something.
Bernays even applied principles from modern social sciences to raising his daughters, trying to learn from his own parents' mistakes.
Yes, which totally reflects his broader worldview that human behavior, even family dynamics, could be analyzed, understood, and perhaps managed or engineered. Their lifestyle was certainly very privileged. They had affluent homes in prestigious New York locations like Washington Square and the Sherry Netherland Hotel later on Fifth Avenue, and eventually a private home in Cambridge.
Larry Ty mentions an insurance appraisal.
Yes, a 1937 insurance appraisal gives a glimpse into their wealth. It lists valuable items like a Steinway grand piano, antique Hepplewhite furniture, art by well-known painters like Derain, lots of decorative pieces, all valued at over $32,000 back then, which Larry Ty calculates as over $300,000 in today's money. They definitely had servants, and the author notes Bernays' clear class consciousness, even mentioning a derogatory nickname he had for his chauffeur, Jack Dupe. His daughters received expensive private schooling, reflecting their upper-class status.
He sounds like a complete workaholic.
Larry Ty describes him explicitly as a workaholic whose social life was almost entirely work-related. Work was his Weltanschauung, his entire worldview. Staff reportedly respected him, despite perceived flaws like being intensely self-absorbed or sometimes stingy. They credited him with teaching them invaluable skills in the emerging field of PR. A former employee named Ralph Boogley recounted Bernays advising him on salary negotiation, telling him not to ask for a job because he needed money but because he deserved it, essentially treating Boogley like a client Bernays himself needed to impress.
And he planned everything meticulously, not just campaigns, but his own life, relationships, even how he interacted with the press.
Oh yes. His papers apparently include detailed plans for things like spying, presumably corporate or political, psychological warfare tactics, and strategies for wooing the press, using the New York Times as his eyes and ears, cultivating relationships with powerful columnists, making life difficult for credentialed journalists, and rallying friendly ones to his cause. His planning documents for the United Fruit Company campaign in Guatemala even included sections contrasting the enemy outlook with the Christian outlook, revealing a starkly polarized, almost Manichaean mindset in that context. He brought this same strategic planning approach to family matters too, like orchestrating the publicity around his daughter Anne's wedding and engagement, sending out telegrams to the press himself.
He moved from New York to Cambridge late in life after nearly 70 years in the city. Why the move?
Yes, apparently feeling somewhat professionally passé in the New York PR world, which had changed significantly by then. But he certainly didn't slow down. He maintained incredibly high energy and became deeply involved in community activism in Cambridge, applying his tried-and-true PR methods to local causes.
Like saving trees.
It's exactly. He spearheaded the emergency committee for the preservation of Memorial Drive, fighting a road project that threatened a beloved stand of sycamore trees. He pitched his arguments to diverse groups, mothers worried about safety, real estate executives concerned about property values, local historians, taxpayers, Harvard affiliates building a broad coalition, and he organized a public spectacle with volunteers acting as 20th century Minutemen, blowing whistles and carrying picket signs to draw media attention. And they won. They saved the trees. He also helped form another committee to block the construction of seminary dorms in a residential neighborhood. He applied the same principles of coalition building and public spectacle to these local issues.
He also engaged in philanthropy later in life.
Yes, donating to a range of causes: Armenian earthquake victims, animal cruelty societies, the Peace Network, women in communications. He also established his own foundation supporting race relations and civil liberties. He still took occasional paying clients, like the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, but Larry Ty notes that some of his later techniques, like relying heavily on influencing opinion leaders, seemed a bit outmoded in a changing media landscape where the public was perhaps less deferential to elites.
What was he like as a grandfather? Was he still the master manipulator, or did they see a different side?
His grandchildren apparently saw a different, softer side, often describing him as a storybook grandfather. He told them adventure stories like Captain Merrywell, let them sit on his lap and pull his mustache and perform magic tricks like pulling a napkin seemingly out of his ear. There was definite charm there.
The author suggests that charm had a flip side, especially as they got older.
Yes. Some grandchildren felt the focus was always relentlessly on him, that he gave constant, unsolicited advice without seeming genuinely interested in them as individuals. His ingrained self-promotion was always noticeable, like the telegram he sent to his granddaughter Anne when she won a writing award, congratulating her for carrying on the Bernays tradition. Even simple things, like proclaiming his fish soup was the best fish soup ever made, were seen by some as part of this constant, almost compulsive need for self-promotion and exaggeration.
He clearly cared deeply, maybe obsessively, about his image and his place in history.
Incredibly so. He continued writing letters to the editor, book reviews, and little notes about himself, often mentioning his own accomplishments well into very old age. He reportedly felt some disappointment in his family relationships in his later years, but found companionship with younger friends. One, Cindy Strauss, described simple moments like cooking for him, eating candy together, and watching Dan Rather on TV, noting he kept the volume incredibly high, but would never admit to being hard of hearing.
He even had a sign over his bed and a theory about longevity.
Yes. He reportedly attributed his long life partly to kissing girls on the lips, and apparently had a sign over his bed that read, "Be sure and kiss Eddie goodnight." He clearly retained a certain magnetic appeal, especially to younger women, even in extreme old age.
And PR professionals continued to flock to him, didn't they? Seeing him as this living icon, a mentor.
They did. He'd invite students to his home, sometimes send them on errands, and dispense advice, often framed by his own experiences. The Joseph Nolan story is a telling anecdote Larry Ty recounts. When Nolan, as a young man, asked Bernays about an expected starting salary, Bernays reportedly scoffed that garbage men made more. Years later, Nolan, by then a successful PR executive himself, confronted Bernays about this dismissive remark. Bernays surprisingly admitted it was a mistake, but then immediately launched into a lengthy defense of his own high speaking fees. Nolan asked why Bernays, with his age and established prestige, kept making those speeches. Bernays simply replied, "Because they asked me to." It shows both a rare moment of vulnerability, perhaps, but also that ingrained drive to be asked, to remain relevant, to be in demand.
He even orchestrated his own birthday parties.
Yes, meticulously, like forming a committee of 90 for his 90th birthday, where the invited guests knew they had been personally chosen and approved by him. It highlights his constant need to control and manipulate even social events to reinforce his status.
Finally, let's tackle the big ongoing debate. Was he truly the father of public relations? The New York Times obituary seems significant. It was very flattering, but it put that title in quotation marks.
That's right. The obituary was indeed very complimentary, called him an early leader, credited him with devising techniques, noted his brilliant success and legendary campaigns, stated his niche assured, and of course mentioned his famous relationship to Sigmund Freud. But yes, the quotation marks around father of public relations suggest some editorial hesitation, or at least a recognition that the title was debated.
And the main contender for that title is usually considered to be Ivy Ledbetter Lee.
Lee is absolutely the other key figure in the early history of PR. A former reporter, his agency was one of the first modern PR firms. He represented major corporations like the Pennsylvania Railroad and Bethlehem Steel. His most famous and perhaps infamous work involved transforming the public image of the Rockefeller family, particularly after the brutal Ludlow massacre during a coal strike in Colorado. He used press notices that controversially framed the violent strike breaking as a necessary blow for industrial freedom.
Lee's stated approach seemed different from Bernays, emphasizing openness and accuracy, at least in theory.
Lee is often credited with establishing a standard of informing the public, rather than just fooling them, and using clear, simple language accessible to the man who rides in the trolley car, as he put it. He emphasized that actions speak louder than words and aimed, rhetorically at least, for greater openness and transparency. though of course critics would argue about how consistently he actually adhered to this ideal in practice, especially with clients like the Rockefellers or later controversial German interests.
So Bernays' claim to the title rested on different points.
Yes. His claim was based on several things. Deliberately coining the term counsel on public relations to professionalize the field, writing the first books attempting to outline a specific methodology and propose a code of ethics for this new profession, and fundamentally viewing PR as a developing social science based on understanding the group mind and herd reaction, drawing on psychology and sociology, as opposed to Lee's view of it as perhaps more of a personal art or craft.
And the popular press at the time and later often seemed to side with Bernays in this debate.
Often, yes. John T. Flynn, writing the Atlantic Monthly, stated Bernays was conditioning the mass mind long before Ivy Lee. Sid Bernstein, a columnist for Advertising Age, wrote that Bernays probably has more right than anyone to be called the father of the profession. And his inclusion as the only PR professional in Life magazine's list of the 100 most important Americans of the 20th century certainly bolstered his claim in the public eye.
Larry Tye also notes that anti-Semitism likely played a role in this debate, and certainly in Bernays' career trajectory.
That's an important point. Despite Bernays' own complicated and sometimes ambivalent relationship with his Jewish identity, almost everyone knew he was Jewish, partly because he often advertised his relationship to Freud. As the scholar Camille Roman noted, Bernays openly discussed issues he felt he had to navigate specifically because he was Jewish and dealing with the predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant business establishment of the time. This background undoubtedly shaped his perspective, his drive, and perhaps his struggle for professional legitimacy against figures like the more establishment-connected Ivy League.
And Bernays actively worked really hard to shape his own legacy, didn't he?
Incredibly actively. He collaborated closely with historians and academics he called experts, like Eric Goldman, Daniel J. Borsten, and Scott Cutlip, encouraging them, sometimes financially supporting them, to write about him and his contributions. He corresponded extensively with historians. His decision to donate his massive collection of personal and professional papers to the Library of Congress, rather than a smaller state historical society, was highly strategic, aiming for a larger audience and attracting more potential biographers. He was apparently aware the papers included unflattering material, like the Guatemala files, but seemed confident that historical judgment would ultimately validate his significance.
Even the donation of his papers involved some self-promotion.
Oh, absolutely. He proposed a grand, symbolic presentation ceremony at the Library of Congress, ideally involving dignitaries like Vice President Hubert Humphrey. His grandchildren clearly saw this constant self-promotion too. They mentioned him checking the indexes of new books to see if he was mentioned. And there's the famous anecdote where his granddaughter Polly wrote, "You will be the father of public relations," on the back of a fortune cookie fortune, knowing it would please him immensely.
Larry Tye ends the section on this debate with a rather pointed, unfinished sentence, which is quite telling.
Yes, he writes, Eddie also would have loved the debate that continues to swirl over whether he really was the father of his profession. He would relish the fact that and then the sentence just stops, leaving it open for us, the readers, to consider what comes next. Perhaps that he ensured the debate would continue, that he remains absolutely central to the story of public relations, no matter what the final conclusion might be. He orchestrated his own enduring relevance.
This entire deep dive into Bernays and his methods really raises some fundamental questions that feel incredibly relevant today, maybe more relevant than ever. Given the examples we've discussed, from linking cigarettes to freedom, to shaping fashion colors, to his deep involvement in the Guatemala coup, how ethical were Bernays' methods, really? Where's that crucial line between legitimate public relations and persuasion and outright, potentially harmful manipulation?
Yeah, and when we look at his undeniable successes, how much was truly down to his specific big think methods, his theories about psychology versus other factors, like his powerful social connections, his undeniable flair for showmanship, maybe sheer luck sometimes, or perhaps even his own tendency to exaggerate his influence when recounting his achievements later. It's hard to disentangle.
And thinking about our world today, just flooded with information, disinformation, conflicting messages, how relevant are Bernays' core ideas and his big think approach in the age of social media, sophisticated data analytics, AI-driven targeting, and deep political polarization? Are his principles just as powerful, or have they evolved into something even more pervasive, more invisible?
That leads to the question. Can individuals, can you listening, effectively protect yourselves from the types of opinion-shaping techniques Bernays pioneered, which are now deployed constantly on a global scale, often algorithmically? What kind of critical thinking skills, what kind of awareness is needed to navigate this incredibly complex landscape and try to make informed choices based on your own reasoning rather than being unconsciously swayed by engineered consent?
And finally, what were the true long-term impacts of some of his most significant campaigns? The Torches of Freedom certainly contributed to normalizing women's smoking, which had devastating public health consequences down the line. The work for United Fruit Company undeniably had catastrophic, long-lasting effects on an entire nation. These actions had real consequences that unfolded over decades, often far beyond Bernays' direct control or maybe even his full comprehension at the time.
Hmm.
So, let's briefly recap where we've been. We've explored Edward Bernays' central and often controversial role in the birth of modern public relations. We've seen his deep fascination with the group mind, with mass psychology, and his signature big think approach.
An approach that aimed not just to promote specific products, but to fundamentally change underlying cultural preferences and behaviors, often using powerful symbols, carefully orchestrated spectacles, and deliberate appeals to instinct and emotion, sometimes over reason.
His campaigns, they are just remarkable case studies. Making women smoke publicly under the banner of freedom, changing national fashion colors to match a cigarette pack, pushing for the interstate highway system, partly to sell more trucks, and even playing a significant role in international affairs and government overthrows.
Yeah.
It showcases a powerful, often indirect, and frequently ethically questionable approach to shaping opinion and, yes, engineering consent on a massive scale.
And the key takeaway for you, listening now, is that the principles Bernays explored, the methods he pioneered, they are not just historical footnotes. They are very much alive and kicking today. They're at play constantly in the stream of information and messaging we all encounter every single day, from the hyper-targeted advertising that follows us online to the political narratives that dominate our news feeds and social media.
So, here's a thought to leave you with, something to consider as you navigate the world around you after hearing all this. In a world where the engineering of consent is undeniably a powerful, ever-present force, constantly working to shape your beliefs, your desires, your actions, how conscious are you of the messages specifically designed to influence you?
And perhaps more importantly, what steps can you take to apply critical thinking to the information you receive? To question the narratives being presented, to pause and strive to make informed choices based on your own reasoning and values, rather than being unconsciously swayed by manipulated instinct or cleverly engineered trends. Consider this deep dive perhaps a first step in becoming more aware of those often unseen forces working to influence you and all of us every single day.